Respected faculty members, senior residents and junior residents, we shall be doing a case presentation and discussion on the case of Brown syndrome and superior oblique palsy. Now coming on to the case, a 5-year-old male child presented to RPC. The informants were the parents and they seem to be reliable. They came with the chief complaint of the child having upward deviation of right eye since 2 months of age, which was present constantly. Parents also noticed the head tilt of the child towards left eye since 1 year of age. There was history of usage of glasses for refractive correction for the past 1 year. No history of any prism use or occlusion therapy in the past. No history of any trauma prior to the incident, and no history of any ocular surgery. Birth history, child was a full-term non-normal vaginal delivery, and the delivery was uneventful. In the family, no history of any similar complaints have been noted in the family members. The systemic examination of the child was within normal limits. Now coming to the ocular examination, the vision for distance in the child's right eye was 6/36, which was improving to 6/12 via pinhole, whereas in the left eye, the vision was 6/36, improving to 6/18 via pinhole. The near vision in both eyes was 9 and 8. The IOP in the right eye and left eye both was 10 millimeters of mercury. Refraction performed revealed 3.5 diopter spherical error and correction, and minus 0.5 diopter cylinder at 180 degrees for the right eye, whereas for the left eye the correction was 3 diopter sphere and minus 1 diopter cylinder at 180 degrees. Conjunctiva and cornea and anterior chamber findings were in normal limits, so were the pupillary lens and fundus findings as well. Now coming to the squint workup, the child showed a head posture which was a left-sided head tilt. There was no face turn and no chin lift was noted for the child. Fixation, the child eyes, both right eye and left eye, showed central, steady and maintained fixation. Now coming to the ocular movements, starting with the primary gaze workup, there is a, as we can see, there is a right eye slightly elevated upwards over the left eye, so this can be either a right eye hypertropia or a left eye hypotropia. Coming to the dextro version, no restricted movements were noted. Coming to the levo version, as you can see in the right eye, there is over elevation on levo version. Coming to the elevation movements, in the left eye, as you can see, there is restriction of movement in the elevating gaze. In the depression, there is no restriction of movements noted. In dextro version, as you can see, left eye, there is restriction of upward movements. Coming to dextro levo version, dextro depression, there is no restriction of movements noted. Coming to levo elevation, as you can see, there is excessive movement of rolling of the right eye, suggestive of inferior oblique overaction on the right eye. Coming to levo depression, there is restriction of levo depression. There is restriction of depression in the right eye, suggestive of superior oblique underaction. The prism bar cover test revealed a 30 prism diopter right over left hypertropia. The Lang's 2-pen test showed a presence of gross stereopsis, while the child was uncooperative for Bragolini striated glass test. On the fundus clinical picture, we can see the fovea for the right eye is below the disc level, suggestive of excycloid origin of the right eye. The first duction test for superior oblique revealed a right eye superior oblique muscle to be lax. For the left eye, the muscle was found to be tight. Thus, we came to the conclusion of a diagnosis of right eye superior oblique palsy with left eye Brown syndrome with both eye ametropic amblyopia. I know.
Good evening, everyone. I will be continuing with the case discussion. So, starting with the relevant anatomy. As we all know, the superior oblique originates superomedial to the optic foramen, passes parallel to the upper part of the medial wall of the orbit, and then turns, goes under the trochlea and turns and takes an angle of 54 degrees with the pretrochlear part. Then it goes below the superior rectus and inserts posterior to the equator. At the trochlea, it takes a turn of about 54 degrees, and the tendinous part of the superior oblique begins about 10 millimeter behind the trochlea. So, coming on to the insertion of the superior oblique, The anterior end inserts 3 to 4.5 mm behind the lateral border of the insertion of superior rectus, and the posterior part inserts 13 mm behind the lateral part of the border of superior rectus insertion. Now the trochlea is a 4 to 6 mm long tube. According to Hevelson, it has 4 components: a cartilage saddle, a intratrochlear portion of superior oblique tendon, a fibrillovascular sheath surrounding the tendon, and a dense fibrous condensation that secures the trochlear saddle and contends to the trochlear fossa of the frontal bone. He also said that there's a bursa-like structure between the trochlear saddle and the vascular sheath of superior oblique tendon. Any pathology of this bursa can lead to a clinical presentation of Brown syndrome. Now the tendon, the superior oblique tendon contains many fibers, and the tendon moves through the trochlea in a sliding telescopic fashion, with central fibers having maximal excursion and peripheral fibers least excursion. So as we can see in this video, the superior oblique, whenever the IO contracts, the superior oblique moves in a telescopic fashion through the tendon, which is about 8 mm in both the directions. And so for elevation in an adducted position, the anterior pole of the eye has to move upward. For this, the posterior insertion of the superior oblique has to move downwards and in an abducted position. So for a good elevation and adducted position, some elasticity of the superior oblique tendon is required. However, if there is any pathology which is restricting the movement of superior oblique tendon through the trochlea, it will present clinically as a Brown syndrome. So, Brown syndrome is inability to elevate eye in adducted position both actively and passively, with no limitation of elevation in abduction. Usually, it is an isolated anomaly, and simultaneous occurrence of Brown syndrome in one eye and superior oblique palsy in other eye is very rare. Its incidence is 1 in 20,000 live births. Occurrence is equal in females and males, and it is mostly unilateral. Only 10% of cases presents as bilaterally, and it is mostly sporadic, and few familial cases of autosomal dominant and autosomal recessive inheritance has been seen. So Brown syndrome can be either congenital or acquired. The causes of congenital Brown syndrome are shortened anterior tendon sheath, normal length tendon with inelastic tendon, and tendon or tendon trochlear complex abnormalities. It is said to happen because of persistence of trabeculae between the tendon and the trochlea. Acquired causes include inflammation, because of which the tendon is not able to pass through the trochlea, infection, trauma, and it can be iatrogenic. Superior oblique palsy is the most common cyclovertical palsy, and it can be either acquired or congenital. Most cases of the superior oblique palsy are congenital, which constitutes about 3/4 of the cases, and in congenital cases it can be either neural or anatomic. So according to in a study, Hevelson saw that 87% of the congenital superior oblique palsy are due to structural abnormality of the superior oblique tendon. Either he classified it into 4 classes. In class 1, there is a redundant tendon, a floppy tendon, which can be easily lifted up from the sclera. In class 2, there was a misdirected tendon, that is, the tendon was inserted nasally than its normal position. In class 3, the tendon was inserted in the tenons, and in class 4, the reflected portion of the tendon was absent. It is also important to understand the muscle sequelae in SO palsy. Here we consider a case of right eye superior oblique palsy. So whenever there is a right eye superior oblique palsy, its antagonist will show overaction, because first there's unopposed action, and then according to Sherrington's law, it will not be inhibited. Also, its yoke muscle, the left inferior rectus, will show overaction because of the Herring's law. So whenever the patient will try to fixate with right eye, the innervation to superior oblique will increase, and so innervation to that of left inferior rectus will also increase, and this will lead to overaction of the left inferior rectus. There's secondary inhibition of left superior rectus because RIO has undergone contracture, and so it will require less innervation. So according to Herring's law, even the left superior rectus will get lesser innervation. So coming on to our case, there can be two possibilities. Either there was a developmental defect in both superior obliques manifesting as Brown syndrome in one eye and superior oblique palsy in the other eye, or bilateral Brown syndrome with spontaneous resolution in one eye. There have been 2 to 3 case reports regarding this. So if there was if there was a second possibility, then Clark and Noel did a study on 38 patients in which they said that they explained the mechanism of the second possibility. So for this, first consider a case of Brown syndrome. In Brown syndrome, there is a restricted elevation and adduction. So because of the restriction, the IO will undergo isometric contraction all the time. So this will lead to secondary inferior oblique overaction. As a result, there is a relative imbalance. Superior oblique muscle is relatively paratic compared to the contracted and fibrotic inferior oblique. But this will not manifest because of the presence of Brown syndrome. Now coming to our case where there was a bilateral Brown syndrome, one eye underwent spontaneous resolution. As a result, this relative imbalance manifested and so it appeared clinically as right eye superior oblique palsy. And so we came to a diagnosis of right eye superior oblique palsy and left eye Brown syndrome. Coming to the clinical features, Brown syndrome is characterized by 6 consistent findings: deficient elevation and adduction, less elevation deficiency in midline, minimal or no deficiency in abduction, V pattern with divergence in upgaze, restricted force ductions, and SO overaction which may or may not be present. Less consistent findings include downshoot in adduction, hypotropia in adduction, widening of palpebral fissure on adduction, anomalous head posture, hypotropia in primary position, trochlear tenderness, and audible or palpable clicks, which are mostly seen in inflammatory cases. Then Brown syndrome was categorized in 3 types on the basis of limitation of elevation in adduction, downshoot or drift on adduction, and hypotropia in primary position. So mild Brown syndrome is when there is only limitation of elevation in adduction. In moderate, it is associated with downshoot or drift on adduction. However, if hypotropia is present in primary position, it is classified as severe Brown syndrome. There is also an entity known as Brown plus, which is defined as hypotropia in primary position and adduction, which is due to SO overaction. These are basically mild and moderate cases of moderate and severe cases of Brown syndrome. So this is a case of mild Brown syndrome in which there is only limited elevation on adduction. Then this is a case of moderate Brown syndrome where there is a downshoot in adduction associated with limited elevation in adduction. And this is a case of severe Brown syndrome where hypotropia is also present in primary gaze. Differential diagnosis of Brown syndrome includes true ioparesis, in which is differentiated as FDT is negative for SO and ioparesis. We get a A pattern, unlike Brown syndrome in which we get a V pattern, and head tilt test is positive. Another differential diagnosis is monoocular elevation deficit, in which elevation deficit in abduction is equal to or more marked than that in adduction, and there may be ptosis or pseudotosis. Blowout fracture of with inferior rectus entrapment is also a DD, in which elevation deficit in abduction and adduction are equal, and there is a history of trauma, enophthalmos, and infravital paresthesia may be present. Congenital fibrosis of extraocular muscles may also present as Brown syndrome, but here also abduction and elevation deficit in abduction and adduction are equal, or that of abduction exceeds than that of adduction. And the patient frequently develop esotropia and upgaze. Adherence syndrome and dysthyroid myopathy are also differentials, and they can be differentiated on the basis of relevant history and the signs of thyroid eye disease. Coming to the features of congenital or long-standing esopalsy, the patient usually presents with abnormal head tilt towards the contralateral side, as we saw in our case. Also, facial asymmetry has been described for long-standing superior oblique palsy, in which the distance between the lateral canthus and the corner of mouth is reduced on the side of head tilt. Diplopia may also be present. Also,
हाँ मैं यहाँ पे slides वगैरह कुछ भी नहीं है.
There's some disturbance going on.
नहीं मेरी नहीं गई.
पूर्णिमा अरे क्या लिखा उसपे?
Also in tendinitis, long-standing
करते हैं
esophageal, we measure large hyperphoria at times exceeding 20 prism diopters. These are due to extension of fusional amplitude beyond the normal range in a child who is trying to fuse since childhood. Also, the squint is relatively concomitant, where primary deviation is equal to secondary deviation. Muscle sequelae are usually fully developed, and it may be difficult to determine primary affected muscle. There's little difference between size of field on Heath chart, and contracture of ipsilateral antagonist is likely present. Also, there's absence of subjective torsion, which is seen on Maddox rod, but if we assess torsion objectively, like fundoscopy, we can note it. Normally, as it was in the patient's left eye, the line passing through the fovea passes in a midway between the optic disc, center of optic disc, and the lower pole. However, in the right eye, we see that the fovea is significantly below the optic disc, suggesting of excyclotorsion, which is our case. Also, the area of binocular single vision is increased. Suppression may be constant or intermittent, and amblyopia may be present. So this was our case, in which in primary gaze we got R by L. On dextro version, there is no limitation of ocular movement, whereas on levo version we can see the upshoot of the right eye, over elevation of the right eye. Then on elevation, there is limited elevation of left eye, and on depression we cannot comment on any restriction of extraocular movements. Then coming to the dextro version, there was no restriction of movements, whereas on dextro elevation there was a limited elevation of left eye in adduction, which suggests of Brown syndrome, and on dextro depression there is no limitation of movement. On levo version, there was an overaction of inferior oblique, which was persistent on levo elevation, and on levo depression we got right superior oblique underaction. So we came to the diagnosis of right eye superior oblique palsy and left eye Brown syndrome. Coming to the management, now for Brown syndrome we usually go for non-surgical mild to moderate non-surgical management in mild to moderate cases. However, if there's severe case threatening binocularity and there's presence of amblyopia, primary position hypotropia, anomalous head posture, or unacceptable downshoots in adduction, we have to go for surgery. And our aim is to correct hypotropia in primary case, reduce downshoots, and expand the binocular diplopia fields. So, our aim, in our case, the aim was to correct the primary position hypotropia. Surgeries for Brown syndromes have been described, which are superior oblique tenotomy, posterior tenectomy for superior oblique, free tenotomy for SO plus minus IO recession, SO recession, Z tenotomy, silicon band expander, and Knapp's chicken suture technique. The outcomes with the first 5 techniques are very unpredictable, and there's a chances of extrusion of silicon band with this technique. We did loop tenotomy of the superior oblique in our case, and the advantages of this procedure was that it is reversible. It can be graded as per FDT. There's less chance of adhesion, less post-op cyclovertical
I think we can leave this slide, Shakya. Let's not get into that detail.
Okay, ma'am.
Okay.
So in this, first we did the FDT for superior oblique, and then we made a limited peritomy. Then this is the superior oblique muscle, and 50 ethibond suture was passed through the superior oblique tendon, and the muscle was disinserted. Then the suture was passed at the insertion, and after that after that the length of the suture was measured and a loop was formed. After a slip knot was placed so that we could adjust it, and then FDT was checked intraoperatively, and here we can see there is no restriction of movement. After that the peritomy was closed, so here we are actually lengthening the superior oblique tendon. Now, management of superior oblique palsy. For this, Knapp classified superior oblique palsy into 7 types and gave management as per the deviation in the field of action. So if deviation is greater in the field of antagonist, that is right IO, the right IO recession is done, that is inferior oblique weakening procedure. If deviation is greater in field of superior oblique, then superior oblique tucking or inferior rectus recession or modified Harda-Ito procedure is done. If the deviation is equal in field of paratic right SO and antagonist right IO, and if then we see at the hypertropia. If hypertropia is less than 25 diopters, then right IO recession is done, and if it is more than 25 diopters, right IO recession with superior oblique tuck is done. Then if it is present in all down gaze position or levo position, then as in class 3 plus left inferior rectus recession and right superior rectus recession is done. And if it is present in all down gaze position, then right superior oblique tuck plus left inferior rectus recession is done. If there is a type 6 type of superior oblique palsy, that is bilateral with a V pattern, bilateral Harda-Ito procedure plus minus IO weakening is done. And if it is type 7, where a Brown syndrome with superior oblique underaction is present, then we explore the trochlea. In our case, we did anteronasal transposition of IO, because as we can see here, that deviation was equal in all field of paratic right SO and right IO, and the hypertropia was greater than 30 diopter, so we had to do an inferior oblique weakening procedure. However, in our case, a significant excyclotorsion was present of the right eye, so we did an anteronasal transposition of IO, in which we moved the insertion of IO 2 mm posterior and nasal to that of the inferior rectus tendon. Like this places the IO nasal to the y-axis and anterior to x-axis and converts it from an extorter and elevator to entorter and tonic depression and adduction. So this is the surgical video. Here the inferior rectus is first. Yes, this is the inferior oblique muscle, and then we cut it. This. After that, the 6-0 Weichel suture is passed through the inferior oblique muscle, and then it is the muscle is placed, inserted 2 mm posterior and nasal to that of the inferior rectus insertion. So this was the post-op clinical picture of the patient, in which no deviation is found in all the 9 gazes. Also, our patient had ametropic amblyopia. The refractive error was +4 diopter with 0.5 diopter cylinder at 180 degree and +4 diopter spherical with -0.5 diopter cylinder at 180 degree, for which we gave refractive correction to the patient. Thank you.
Yeah, so I would just like to, highlight some key points regarding the case. Can you please go back to your case presentation, the pre-op pictures? Shakya?
Yes, ma'am.
Can you please go back to your case presentation, the pre-op pictures, clinical pictures?
Yes, ma'am.
So I understand this is a pretty, kind of confusing case. There are too many things into this case. But if I have to simplify them, when you look at the primary position first. If you look at the primary position of this patient, he has R by L. That means there is a right hypertropia and left hypertropia. So the most common cause of vertical squint paralysis is superior oblique palsy. So that's the first thing we need to look at. So if you look at the secondary gazes, especially on levo version, the gaze, the amount of hypertropia is increasing, which is suggestive of an inferior oblique overaction. At the same time, on levo depression, there is superior oblique underaction, if you can see there, right? So if you look at just right eye, it seems that it's pretty clear that it's probably a case of SOP. The another way to confirm is to do what? What is the confirmatory test for SOPs? Can anybody tell?
Ma'am, Parkes 3-step test.
Yeah, Parkes 3-step test. So this on the first step, you look at the primary deviation. So as in this case, there is a right hypertropia which is increasing on the contralateral gaze, that is on levo version, and on same side tilt. Do we have tilt pictures for this patient?
Ma'am, actually, no, ma'am. The patient was very uncooperative. And ma'am,
Okay.
for Park three-step test, there must be free movement of the other eye. It should be isolated palsy. That's why it is not applied for this case.
Yes, you are absolutely right. So it may not be so useful in this case, but if you still find that if you still tilt the head of this patient on the same side, that is on the right side, you will still find that the hypertropia. Because if you look at the left eye, it appears that there is a left hypertropia. The left eye is not moving up in adduction. So look at that dextro elevation picture. Can you put your arrow there, a cursor? Yes. So if you the eye is not moving up in adduction. However, it is moving very nicely, elevating in abduction. Please go on the levo elevation side. Yeah. So if you compare the two sides, you know that the adduction, elevation in adduction is much more limited as compared to elevation in abduction, which is a very, very classical features of Brown. Now, if you have this kind of picture, mostly there is no doubt, but the most common differential at this stage is 2. What are those 2 differentials?
Ma'am,
Yeah, anybody?
ma'am, monoocular elevation deficit
Yes.
and
Which one is something which is more obvious? Tushar is there? Something you guys often confuse with is idiopalsy. Can you see there? Right?
Yes.
So that is the most common confusion that occurs, whether it's an idiopalsy or it's a Brown syndrome or it's a monoocular elevation deficit. And it's important to differentiate all 3 of them. Why? Because the management differs with all 3 of them. So of course FDT is the confirmatory test, but before that you can also clinically differentiate. How can you clinically differentiate, Shakya?
ma'am, pardon, please.
How can you clinically differentiate an idiopalsy from a
Ma'am, in
Brown syndrome?
idiopalsy, we will get an A pattern, whereas in Brown syndrome, we usually get a V pattern. And on FDT, in idiopalsy, the SO will be free, whereas in Brown syndrome, it will be restricted.
Yeah, that's great. So as we all know that the superior oblique overactions will cause A pattern, and in cases of idiopalsy, the A pattern should be more prominent. Yes, but as you can see this case, if we move from down to up gaze, can you please move your cursor?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so from down to up gaze, the eyes are kind of diverging. They are diverging out, especially on the levo side. If you see, they are diverging out. So this is a sign that there is something tight which is not allowing eye to move freely up, and it is causing the divergence. Now this tightness could be because of tight SOP or could be tight superior oblique palsy, or could be because of tight inferior rectus. So your MED is the differential. Now how will you differentiate? Now if you look at MED, which is monocular elevation deficit, in that case the SR limitation is much more significant, or the SR underaction is much more significant than the IO underaction. But is absolutely reverse in this case. It is the IO underaction which is much more significantly seen as compared to SR underaction. So it is not a case of MED, it is not a case of idiopalsy, it is probably a case of, not probably, it is indeed a case of left eye Browns. But it's very interesting to know that the 2 entities are coexisting. On one side you have underaction of superior oblique, as in superior oblique palsy. On other side you have tight superior oblique. So it's very interesting. And why does that happen? What Shakya was trying to point out, that there can be 2 possibilities. Either there is an inherent abnormality of superior oblique tendon in both the eyes. Abnormality could be in form of short tendon, or fibrosis of the tendon, or fibrotic tendon, or the tendon adhesions of tendon, that it is not allowing that free telescopic movement, which is leading to the Browns on one hand. On the other hand, it's a lax tendon, absolutely lax tendon causing, or absent tendon causing superior oblique palsy. that one possibility is there, that there is true anatomical defect, two organic pathologies in the same patient at two different sites.
Thank you,
Voice
ma'am.
disturbance.
I think we have to move to the next presentation now.
Yeah, Praful, I'll just take
Discussion.
2 minutes. I'll just take 2 minutes. Right? Just 2 more minutes. So if you have, so one possibility is there that there is an actual organic problem in both the eyes. The other possibility is there that to begin with it was a bilateral browns. On one side it got spontaneously resolved on its own, leading to a secondary superior oblique overaction because of the superior oblique underaction because of the constant inferior oblique contracture. Right, so this is a second possibilities. Now we may not actually know why this has which one is the true unless we do imaging studies. Imaging studies have also been described in such cases where you can find a small hypoplastic tendon on the paralytic side, while on the normal on the brown side you will have the normal tendon. So that's one way of finding out whether it's a true pathology of the tendon itself or it's a spontaneously resolved Brown syndrome. Right, so that thing you have to keep in mind, but not that it makes any difference in our management. The management still remains. The management of Brown syndrome is to weaken the SO or loosen the SO till the time when the FDT is totally free. Okay, while the management of superior oblique palsy is very simple, you have to weaken the muscles in the direction where the deviation or the diplopia is maximum. So in this case, it was maximum in a contralateral elevation. That's the reason we did IO. And in Brown syndrome, as I said, the idea, irrespective of the type of the Brown, the category of the Brown, the severity of Brown, the idea is to loosen the superior oblique, expand the tendon as much as you can, which can be done with the help of expander, or which can be done with the help of non-absorbable sutures. Okay, so I think that should be the take-home message in this particular case. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Livia Khan, JR second semester. We have a 29-year-old female, a resident of Rajasthan, doing an office job in a computer firm, who had presented with a history of chronic sensation of itching for the last 13 years and diminution of vision in both the eyes, right more than left eye, for the last 6 years. The chronic sensation of itching, along with watering of eyes, started since 2006. And diminution of vision in both the eyes started since 2015, which was insidious in onset and gradually progressive and painless. There was also a history of frequent changes in the power of glasses, thrice in the last 1 year. The spectacle usage started from a very early age, with increasing power of glasses over the time. There's also a history of using topical anti-allergic medication and on and off steroid formulation for excavation of the allergic conjunctivitis, and also a history of contact lens usage and C3R procedures done twice, right eye in 2017 and left eye in 2019. There is no family history and also no history of any atopic symptoms or any other systemic illness. Now on ocular examination, our presentation, we see that the uncorrected visual acuity was 3/16 in the right eye and 6/24 in the left eye. The best corrected visual acuity on contact lens was 6/18 in the right eye and 6/9 partial in the left eye. Near vision was N12 in right eye and N6 in left eye. On further examination, we see that in conjunctiva, few papillae were present in both the eyes, but no active congestion. In the examination of the cornea of the right eye, we see that there's a central nebular opacity with conical protrusion. There's also stromal thinning and prominent corneal nerves. We can also see a Munson sign and Risutis phenomenon in this patient on the right eye. On the left eye, there is also prominent corneal nerves along with Vogt stria. This is an image where we see an ectatic cornea along with the Vogt stria of this patient. On further examination, we see that the anterior chamber, the pupil, lens, and the fundus examinations are within the normal limits in both the eye, the IOP being also normal in both the eyes. On refraction, we see that there was scissoring reflex present in both the eyes. Refraction under HA 2%, we noted that in the right eye, minus 10 diopter sphere with minus 3.5 diopter cylinder at 55-degree axis with acceptance of 6/18, and on the left eye, minus 3.5 diopter sphere, minus 2.25 diopter cylinder at 90-degree axis with acceptance of 6/9. On investigations, we see that the AL on the right eye was 23.919 and in the left eye 23.03. The KM being in the right eye, K1 is 58.39 diopter and K2 being 61.27 diopter. In the left eye, K1 being 48.07 diopter and K2 being 49.92 diopter. Specular count was 3546 in the right eye and 3752 in the left eye. On pentacam values, we see that the thinnest was 364 microns in the right eye and 429 micron in the left eye, which was significantly reduced, and posterior elevation being 98 in the right eye and 29 in the left eye. The Kmax value was also increased in the right eye, being 67.4 and 51.0 in the left eye. The D value was also very increased in the right eye, being 16.35 and 6.56 in the left eye. Here is a 4-map refractive of the right eye of the patient, showing that the steepest keratometry in the right eye in the sagittal curvature map corresponding with the pachymetry. The elevation in the front elevation, the back elevation were also increased. Here is the Bellin-Ambrosio enhanced ectasia map, which is also showing that there is an area of ectasia which is highlighted in the red, there's an area of ectasia. We can see that there's also corneal thickness spatial profile is also showing an abnormality, and the percentage thickness increase is also outside the outside the 2 standard deviation. Here's a 4-map refractive map of the left eye of the patient, which is also showing the steepest keratometry in the sagittal curvature, which is corresponding with the pachymetry map, and there's also an increase in the anterior and the posterior elevation of the same. Here is the Bellin-Ambrosio enhanced ectasia map of the left eye, which is also showing area of ectasia and the values being also abnormal. We reached a diagnosis of both eye chronic vernal keratoconjunctivitis with keratoconus with cross-linked cornea. On ABCD criteria staging, we could find out that the right eye was in stage 4 and the left eye was in stage 2. Thank you. Further discussion will be carried on by Dr. Arush.
Hello, I'm Dr. Arush and I'll be carrying on where Dr. Livia left off. So we see a 29-year-old female who had progressive diminution of vision in both eyes since the past 6 years and history of eye rubbing since late childhood. She had been using spectacles with frequent change in power. In 2015, when the patient presented to us, she had a best corrected visual acuity of 6/12 parts in the right eye and 6/9 in the left eye, with refractive error of around -10 in the right eye and -3.5 with significant cylinder in both eyes. Initially, the patient was prescribed with spectacles, but due to the high anisometropia, which was corrected by spectacles, led to uncomfortable anisoconia, which led to the patient being prescribed contact lenses. Initially, the patient was prescribed conventional rigid gas permeable contact lenses in both eyes, but the patient became non-compliant over time. There was also a history of progression in both eyes, which led to corneal cross-linking being administered in the right eye in 2017 and in the left eye in 2019. When the patient was admitted in January of this year, the visual acuity was considerably reduced and the patient was having significant non-compliance and discomfort with contact lenses. So in this patient, the challenges we faced was a history of chronic allergy and frequent itching of eyes, which needs to be adequately controlled before we take the patient for further management. The visual rehabilitation, which was not possible with contact lenses, and non-compliance to rigid gas permeable lenses, and also the affordability of the patient for a scleral contact lens. And the limitations for the surgical intervention being the availability of corneal tissue, especially in these COVID times, the chance of rejection, the chances of infection, and the conversion of the procedure to a full thickness keratoplasty. So in this patient, we see the patient was a classic case of advanced keratoconus in the right eye. Initially, the patient was prescribed rigid conventional RGP lenses. Once the patient could not comply with them, the patient was then transferred onto rose K lenses. And even the patient was compliant on rose K lenses for a period of 1 to 1.5 years. After then, the patient was prescribed scleral contact lenses. But the problem with scleral contact lenses is that the cost is very high, around 30,000 rupees per eye. But the advantages of scleral contact lenses in these patients, especially the patients which have advanced keratoconus, is that they vault the cornea and there's no corneal touch. So any further corneal scarring is limited, which was already a factor in our patient that had developed a nebular corneal opacity in the visual axis. These also provide a tear fluid reservoir which correct astigmatism, much like rigid gas permeable lenses. Actually, scleral contact lenses are just specialized contact lenses which have a larger diameter and they mainly touch the sclera and there is no corneal touch. There is also much greater comfort to the patient and ease in fitting and handling. But due to the high cost involved with scleral contact lenses, the patient was given both options. But the patient opted for the surgical procedure, and the advantage of the surgical procedure is basically cost effective to some extent for the patient, and there's also long durability if the graft is taken well. The disadvantages, as is involved with any surgical procedure, involved infection, the risk of graft rejection, and the other risks of keratoplastic procedures. This is an anterior segment optical coherence tomography picture of the patient when the patient was admitted in January of this year, and this was basically done to ascertain the depth of the involvement of the cornea. And here we can see a hyperechoic light nebular opacity in the central cornea. A global pachymetry was also done to plan for the surgery. And the surgery which was planned in this patient was a deep anterior lamellar keratoplasty. And this is the surgical procedure. So we used the 8.5 mm trephine to prepare the host cornea. Needle was inserted around 60% of the depth of the stroma, and air was injected till a large bubble was created, and this was confirmed with the opacification of the stroma due to the misarrangement of the lamellae of the stroma. Then a nick was given in the centralmost portion of the cornea, and a little viscoelastic was injected. Here we see a nick is being given, and a little viscoelastic is injected. Now the host the superficial layers of the cornea are removed via quadrants, and we can see the descending membrane being separated. It is a glistening membrane. Then the donor cornea is put and sutured to the prepared bed of the host cornea. Sutures are buried, and that's it. Post-operative day 1, the patient was the post-op day 1 was pretty clear. No discharge and congestion was present. The first day post-op patient had a visual acuity of finger rounding at 1 meters, which improved to a uncorrected visual acuity of 636 at post-op 1 week. The rest of the examination was within normal limits, with all the sutures being buried, and 12 sutures monofilament nylon were placed. This is the post-op day 1 picture of the anterior segment OCT of the patient, and we can see the graft is taken well. Now I'll briefly discuss an approach to a patient such as ours which has keratoconus due to an underlying vernal keratoconjunctivitis or any allergic conjunctivitis. So basically, in a patient which was, I would classify it as a mild to moderate case of vernal keratoconjunctivitis, she had episodes of around 2 to 3 per year, which occasionally required steroids to be controlled. And on serial ophthalmologic examinations, no side effects of glaucoma or cataract were seen. For a patient with chronic VKC, any steroid ocular side effects, we need to monitor them on all ophthalmological examinations. We can the management and severity of VKC Benini grading is used. In this grading, we can see that as symptoms were mild to moderate, but there was also some corneal involvement. So VKC grade, our patient would be classified under moderate persistent. The treatment would initially include lifestyle modifications, which include cold compresses, avoiding eye rubbing, and dark glasses. Topical lubricants provide symptomatic relief in the acute phase, as well as washing out inflammatory mediators from the tear film and protecting from mechanical rubbing effect of the papillae. This is a very simplified flowchart which just explains how VKC can lead to keratoconus. The basic pathology is that VKC leads to chronic eye rubbing, which leads to micro trauma on the epithelial surface and damage to the corneal epithelium. And there are release of inflammatory mediators such as MMP13 and IL-6 and TNF alpha. These basically cause destruction of the proteins and denaturation, which leads to corneal thinning and ectasia. Now, various studies have been taken out to find a cause and effect relationship between VKC and keratoconus. Incidence of keratoconus in VKC patients has ranged in different studies from 7% to as high as 26.8%. Age of presentation, as we know, is usually 11 to 21 years in keratoconjunctivitis patients, and average duration of VKC prior to development of keratoconus ranges from 2 to 12 years. Now we see that vernal keratoconjunctivitis with severe clinical signs such as pseudogerontoxin, shield ulcer, and punctate epithelial keratitis, these will have a higher chance of progression to keratoconus. Corneal hydrops, which is also a very vision-threatening complication of keratoconus, is more commonly seen in patients with keratoconus which have an underlying vernal keratoconjunctivitis. This is due to the chronic eye rubbing which is associated and which can lead to rupture of the already thinned out cornea. Keratoplastic procedures which are done for keratoconus and VKC usually have a poor outcomes as there is already a baseline inflammation in the eye. And for any patient that we come across in OPD or wherever who has a VKC, the patient needs to be appropriately screened so that any keratoconus or early ectatic changes can be picked up. The diagnosis will involve a plethora of clinical evaluation and laboratory investigations. Initial management, as we saw that our patient was initially she was diagnosed in 2015 when the refractive error in the right eye was around -10 and the left eye was around -3. She had a vision of 6/18 with spectacles in the right eye, but when such a high degree of anisometropia is corrected with in the spectacle plane, the patient had significant complaints of anisogonia which she could not tolerate, and thus she was prescribed with conventional RGP contact lenses in both eyes. But due to a very high irregular surface of the right cornea, which was around I think -67 diopters of keratometry was there, she could not tolerate the conventional RGB contact lenses. After that, she was prescribed with rose K lenses. Rose K lenses basically have a posterior curve that is more closely opposed to the abnormal conical contour of the ectatic cornea. These are viable options for patients unable to wear the conventional RGP lenses. And as we see that these are suitable for advanced keratoconus patients. Our patient was comfortable on rose K lenses for almost 1 to 1.5 years when she again started having difficulty, which could signify a progression which was detected on pentacam. Now, various studies have tried to define ectasia progression. As we see, keratoconus is basically an interplay of two things, that is thinning and protrusion. So the factors which were taken into account to quantify ectasia, there is progressive steepening of the anterior corneal surface and progressive steepening of posterior corneal surface, added with the progressive thinning or increase in rate of thickness change from periphery to the thinnest point. But there is no global consensus as to a quantification of the ectatic change. In this scenario, our center has come up with a very nice criteria for progression, where we take change in keratometry value of over 1 diopter within a year, change in corneal astigmatism of over 0.5 diopters within a year, and thinnest pachymetry decrease basically of more than 20% within a year. As we saw in our patient, both eyes had been subject to corneal cross-linking at some point, 2017 in the right eye and 2019 in the left eye. The ideal candidate for a corneal cross-linking procedure is a patient who is contact lens tolerant and has a progressive keratoconus with a clear central cornea and thinnest corneal thickness of more than 400 microns. The main goal of corneal cross-linking is to slow down the progression, and the principal effect is localized to the anterior part of the stroma. The basic mechanism underlying corneal cross-linking basically involves photopolymerization of riboflavin molecules by the UVA radiations, which leads to more covalent bonds being formed both between the fibrils and within the fibrils, which leads to increased rigidity of the cornea. We follow the Dresden protocol, which commonly involves an isotonic riboflavin, which is 0.1% riboflavin and 0.9% of NaCl in 20% dextran solution. But for corneas that are thin, that is less than 400 microns, where we cannot afford to change the thickness very much, we choose to use hypoosmolar riboflavin, which basically causes swelling of the already thinned out cornea. Here we use 0.5% riboflavin with 0.9% of NaCl. Intrastomal corneal ring segments are another novel treatment, which are the main goal here is to improve the contact lens tolerance. Our patient could not be fitted with these intrastomal corneal ring segments, as they also require a corneal thickness of at least 400 microns. And we saw that the right eye of our patient was significantly thinned out, approximately 364 microns. There are several contraindications to this procedure too, which include patients on isotretinoin, amiodarone, pregnant and nursing mothers, collagen vascular diseases, and other corneal dystrophies. So, and in the last treatment procedure that is left for such patients which cannot achieve visual rehabilitation by the scleral contact lenses, whether it be due to the cost factor or any other fitting procedures, the last remaining treatment remains the corneal transplantation procedures. Initially, as penetrating keratoplasty showed very promising results, but with more developments in the surgical procedures, DALK has now become the mainstay of treatment in patients with keratoconus. DALK basically requires that the descemet membrane and the endothelium barrier should be intact. If there are any tears or there is deep scarring, then we would like to prefer a penetrating keratoplasty. And if there is an isolated descemet scar, if that is also visual axis free, we can proceed with the DALK procedure. Now, deep anterior lamellar keratoplasty, the advantages is that it has it can be done in thin corneas. Deep stromal scars can be dissected, and better visual outcome is there, and it is not machine dependent. Descemetic, basically of two types, descemetic DALK and pre-descemetic DALK. Descemetic DALK basically means that we have exposed completely the descemet membrane of the host, where pre-descemetic DALK we will require layer by layer manual dissection, and at least 10% of the stroma, posterior stroma, is left behind. There are both advantages and disadvantages to both the procedures. Descemetic DALK has basically, it creates a natural anatomical barrier between the host descemet membrane and the donor stroma. This leads to a faster recovery, but as this requires a steep learning curve, and there is also an increased risk of perforation as we are directly exposing the patient's descemet membrane. In pre-descemetic DALK, the advantage is that it can be done in case of heel hydrops, as we are leaving a thin layer of posterior stroma. The disadvantage is that although the risk is less, but there is a risk of full thickness perforation and the recovery is slower. Penetrating keratoplasty keratoconus has very favorable outcomes. It is surgically less challenging and also less time taking. Indications include deep central descemet scarring, coexisting endothelial dysfunction, macro perforation, which are very common with DALK, and cases with thin stroma or the cone very protuberant. Now, the main factors which have led to DALK being considered over PK include basically there is no risk of endothelial graft rejection, reduced endothelial cell loss, which ultimately leads to improved graft survival. It is basically an extraocular procedure as the descemet membrane and endothelium of the patient are left intact. and in this way it is less dependent on topical corticosteroids. The limitations being it is obviously more technically demanding, prolonged operative time. Astigmatism rates are pretty similar, as sutures are also involved in this case, and there is a risk of conversion to penetrating keratoplasty. The many techniques that have been developed, as we saw in the video, we saw the big bubble technique. Other techniques which have been developed, which basically involve stripping the host stroma away from the host descendant membrane, include viscodissection, hydrodelamination, manual peeling, microkeratome, and femtosecond assisted DALK. Complications of DALK will include the most common being the descendant membrane perforation. There is also pseudo anterior chamber, Uret-Zavalia syndrome, interface wrinkling, epithelial and stromal rejection, interface vascularization, and interface keratitis, which is a complication which is unique to DALK in comparison to PK, as there is a formation of an interface between stroma and descendant membrane. As we saw, the most common complication of DALK is the descendant membrane perforation. The incidence in big bubble DALK is 4% to 10%. Risk factors will include corneal scarring near the descendant membrane. And the corneal thickness is less than 250 microns. Obviously, inexperienced surgeon will also lead to a high risk of descendant membrane perforation in cases of DALK. There are mostly there are two types of perforations that have been classified in descendant membrane perforations due to DALK. There are micro perforations and macro perforations. Micro perforations are that allow a small output of aqueous material, and macro perforations are that lead to a complete collapse of the anterior chamber. The management also varies. In a case of micro perforation, we can just inject air, and that will lead to sealing of that defect, and then we can convert to a manual procedure and careful stromal dissection. In a case of macro perforation, we will need to convert it to a full thickness penetrating keratoplasty. The incidence varies with big bubble DALK. There is a higher risk of macro perforations in comparison to manual layer by layer dissection. But in cases of manual layer by layer dissection, there is obviously a high risk of micro perforations. So that's all I would like to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Livia and Arushi. Livia and Arush. Nimi, you're there. Would you like to summarize before we? Is Nimi there?
Ma'am.
Okay. Yes. Would you like to summarize? Would you like to say something?
Yes, ma'am.
Before I take on a few questions and clarify a few points in your presentations.
Yes, ma'am. Good evening, everyone. So this case was a case of vernal keratoconjunctivitis, which the patient had from the usual presenting age, which is in the early childhood period, which resulted in chronic eye rubbing. Then after a prolonged period, she started having diminution in vision, which then progressed to a situation where she had very much disability in vision in her right eye and compared to left eye, resulting in keratoconus and requiring management, which was a long-term procedure that the patient had because of the vernal keratoconjunctivitis, which started at an early age. So any patient of keratoconus, when you start managing, if the patient has history of eye rubbing or itching sensation, control of this process, this chronic symptom is most importantly needed. This can be done using any anti-allergic drops if needed. Lifestyle modifications can be advised. And then if still there is and frequent screening of the patient with a modality like Pentacam, which is available in our center or in some other place if you are working using a VKG or keratometry, which needs to be constantly monitored so that early picking up of the keratoconus can be done. And on frequent follow-up like 3 monthly, if there is progression that is being seen in pediatric population, CXL should be done at a pretty early stage. So then a CXL can be considered depending on the thickness of the cornea, and isotonic riboflavin or a hypoosmolar riboflavin or other techniques for thin cornea can be done. Then visual rehabilitation is another important factor, which can be done initially with spectacles if there is milder ectasia,
or even soft contact lenses can be used if it is milder ectasia. But if the ectasia is very much and if the astigmatism is too much, the patient might need a conventional RGP lens. If even that is not tolerable, specialized RGP lenses, especially Rosky lenses, which are specially made for keratoconus patients, can be prescribed. Most of the patients will be comfortable with a Rosky lens. But if even Rosky lenses are not being accepted by the patient, then we might have to consider a scleral lens. But it is a costly thing, but the patient can also be given the option of surgery. So scleral lens is a better option because the surgical intervention is not needed. But the thing is that scleral contact lens is costlier, and also there is a reservoir which will get deposited, and in between the day the patient might have to just take the lens out from his eye and then again put it back. So that can be awkward for the patient. And also surgery is also not a sure shot procedure. The patient can have rejection, infection. So all these options have to be given to the patient. And other options which can be considered is an intracorneal ring segment. If the patient has adequate thickness and there is pretty stable, just visual rehabilitation is to be done, we can go for intracorneal ring segments. And also there are combination of procedures also available. CXL can be combined with PRK, LASIK, or even toric IOL can be put if the keratoconus is stable. And even CXL can be combined with intracorneal ring segment. At last thought, if the patient is not having any amount of visual rehabilitation, we can consider a lamellar procedure like DALK, which was done in our patient, or a keratoplasty procedure. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Nimi. I think that was a very comprehensive coverage on a case presentation. I think there's always a strong urge for all our residents to take our case presentations into a mode of a symposium. I will strongly urge you to keep a case presentation like a case presentation. So always discuss points which are pertinent to your particular case rather than putting forward it as like a symposium. And then, the learning points or the take-home points do not sink in very well in that scenario. I'll just correct a few points which I want to clarify on the slides which were presented. For Livia, when you're presenting topography maps for, as a matter of fact, any investigations, residents should consider always removing all those places where identity of the patients are being shown. So please do take care that in all your presentations, the identity, the UHID number, the name, the gender, or such details of any patient, if you're presenting their data, is on your presentation, then those will have to be obscured before you're presenting. And again, when you're talking about topography maps, it's nice not just to talk about just figures, but point out and say, this is the region of the map you look in first. I think you did have a topography class yesterday, so I'm not going back into the details again. But just to highlight again, please always talk about the map saying, this is the region you look at. These are the maps, the K1, K2 values. You're going to look at the Kmax here. You're looking at the thinnest pachymetry. You're looking at the topography pattern. So that's how you read a map, and rather than just reading out your figures on those maps. Another point is the ABCD classification is not as just a stage 3 or a stage 4 or a stage 2. But the ABCD stands for anterior corneal curvature, B for posterior corneal curvature, C for corneal thickness, D for distance visual acuity. There are particular parameters for each of these 4 factors, and it is given like for an A1, B3, C4. So I think you missed out on that particular aspect when I told you to classify according to ABCD. So that's going to be a homework for all of you to go back and read what the ABCD classification signifies here. Again, apical scarring in a case of keratoconus does not occur because of contact lens wear only. You could have primary apical scarring in a case of keratoconus per se because of the disease itself. That's something which I thought Arush mentioned or sort of indicated that a contact lens will cause scarring. When a keratoconus fitting on contact lenses is done on an apical bearing philosophy, that will lead to a scarring on the apex. So you have to remember the way you fit contact lenses is also important, so that that an apical bearing fit can cause apical scarring here. What you need to know is when you need to take your patients for surgery. The primary rehabilitation for early keratoconus is glasses, spectacles, contact lenses. Contact lenses, depending upon the severity, could be simple RGP lenses, or you would take them into multi-curve lenses. Rose-K is one such multi-curve lenses. Okay, and in very advanced ectasias, you have scleral contact lenses. There are differences in these three types of lenses. So another take-home point for you is that you go back and read contact lens fitting in keratoconus. This can be one of your short notes or questions on your viva here. Again, deep anterior lamellar keratoplasty, I think I will not delve into the details. That becomes a fellowship level discussion. That it's nice to know the types of DALs you have, the plus and minuses, the bubbles which are there, type 1, type 2, type 3. Might not be commonly asked in your viva, but it is knowledgeable. It's good to be knowledgeable about them as well. So important things here is in vernal keratoconjunctivitis or in ocular allergy, there are inflammatory mediators which are persisting on the ocular surface continuously. Keratoconus conventionally is described as a non-inflammatory ectatic disease, but recent literature and a lot of research in recent years points towards that the inflammatory mediators, because of chronic allergy, is one of the causative factors for occurrence of keratoconus in this scenario. So that's something you people have to take home. We have a very nice article of pediatric keratoconus which has just come out in the IJO February issue. I would urge all of you to read about it, to look at all the current perspectives of pediatric keratoconus in this. And you should know when you have to take your patient for surgery, when visual rehabilitation falls lesser than 618 with the best optical device which is used for rehabilitation, you would take in such patients for surgical interventions. Otherwise, advanced ectasia scleral contact lenses do work wonderfully well, and you can fit these patients up to 6/9 or better vision here. So that worked well for our patient. You could see that the anisoconia in both eyes, there was a minus 10, minus 11 refraction with cylinder compared to the minus 3.5 in this particular patient. So we were effectively able to lift her unaided visual acuity from 2/60. I saw her today in the OPD. She's 636, and her astigmatism or her curvature has gone down by over almost 15 to 17 diopters. She's 48 and 50D in her right eye K1, K2. So that's when we use surgery to effectively rehabilitate. Surgery has its own plus and minus points as well. I think these will be the take-home messages for today. And if you have any questions, you are most welcome to ask, or we can conclude. Does anybody have any questions?
Ma'am, there are no questions, but thank you, ma'am, for the comprehensive. And the most important part is, I think, whatever ma'am said, all SR should note that case presentation, don't make it a symposium.
Yes.
Case presentation, just discuss your case. No need to discuss everything
Absolutely.
starting on classification, diagnosis. The problem is that in that case, don't have time to discuss anything like in the first case.
I really think to reorient
this in mind in the next presentation.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you all.
खोल के रखो।